Ladies and gentlemen, let's Red Gamer Telecom video. Let's discuss Ubisoft again and the whole frame rate debacle, because let's just be totally honest right now, it's in the media a hell of a lot. Recently, there's been a post on Reddit, and they mentioned during a skill presentation about game programming, a Ubisoft engineer, a game architect, as well as someone from PR popped in and were giving a lecture, in other words their opinions on the gaming industry. Now during this presentation they happened to let slip a few very interesting nuggets regarding parity. Basically console makers are pressuring towards parity, and in fact in some cases they're actually trying to limit the frame rate on PC versions as well. Moreover, they also discuss a few other really interesting topics, such as being asked to reuse code as much as possible, and so on and so on. So, this original post, as I said, was on Reddit, but there was proof that was attached, which basically showed an image of the people and the lecture hall, where, of course, these people from Ubisoft actually attended, as well as all of the students. So anyway, it started out by asking regarding, well, what happened with Watch Dogs. And during the presentation, the online programmer had said that just before the games was released, you have to send a copy to console manufacturers, and then they tell you what to keep and what to throw away. So yeah, that's what maybe happened with Watch Dogs. Now, in case you're wondering what that means, if you remember the whole visual downgrade system for Watch Dogs, does everyone remember those really awesome E3 demos? And of course, later on we found out, well, yeah, that's not really how the game looks on next generation consoles, and there were all those like downgrade threads that popped up on NeoGAF and all of the regular places. So, what we found out is that those settings still exist on the PC, they were simply disabled. So the theory here, because we'll go into this more in just a second, is that the console makers basically found out about this, and they basically asked Ubisoft to start downgrading the game for parity on all of the systems. Indeed, regarding the whole 30 frames per second versus 60, the game architect had said, and I quote, that they aim for 60 frames per second, but due to limitations, they have to settle for 30 FPS in recent games. They then implied that console makers are pressuring them to make sure that the same thing is true on the PC. And in fact, specifically was implicating Microsoft in the whole parity issue. In fact, they said that they're trying to get them to lock frame rate on the PC, and indeed sarcastically mentioned, but our eyes can't see past 24 FPS anyway, and then winked. So, this is obviously being sarcastic, because if you Google around, you'll actually find lots of evidence that our eyes can indeed see well beyond, even 100 frames a second, even 200 frames a second. Even the United States Air Force actually conducted a test, and this test was that they were measuring visual response times of pilots. Could they distinguish like small changes in light, for example? And in fact, in their experiment, a picture of an aircraft was flashed on screen in a dark room for 2/20th of a second. So in other words, that would be equivalent of 220 frames per second. The pilots were consistently able to see this after image, as well as actually identify the aircraft that was being shown. So going back to what I was saying, this basically means if you were to look at the history of gaming, the SNES, all of those consoles were all operating at 60 frames per second. Unless, of course, you're in the PAL region. Then, you've got the PlayStation 1, the Saturn, a lot of those games, once again, operating at 60 frames per second. Like Virtua Fighter 2, for example, 60 FPS. And it was a really big deal, because people were so happy that the title was running at 60 FPS. And back in the day, if you remember, like, the old Quakes, people were actually playing on CRTs at really low resolutions so that they can have the refresh rate high enough in the GPU to be able to push out enough frames, and ideally they would be getting like 100 frames per second plus. In fact, if you actually were to go ahead and Google and look at some old tweak guides for these games, most people would see that like 60 FPS was like considered like bare minimum playable. For a lot of the hardcore Quake heads and CSGO players, they were really looking for like 100 frames per second plus. So what about the whole AI? Well, it's actually really funny. Now, there are a couple of points I'd like to make on this one. Firstly, reusing AI. There was a lot made regarding the AI in Watch Dogs. Not only how many, well, dudes are around you, but also how realistic that AI was. Apparently, they're actually heavily encouraged to reuse as much code as possible. So, although you couldn't implicitly state it, there's a very good chance that, well, this is the reason that the Watch Dogs AI was not as good as what it was possibly advertised to be initially, because the Watch Dogs AI has been confirmed to actually have been taken from Assassin's Creed for the most part. In fact, when they were asked about the impact of the AI running on the APUs of the consoles, they actually said that Microsoft actually encouraged them to run the AI on the cloud because of hardware limitations. And then they were asked, well, what's your actual preferred platform to develop on? Bear in mind, these are not PR guys that are asking, although there was a PR person there, or, yeah, there was one PR person there. Oh, actually a HR person, I'm sorry. And so there's a game architect, an online programmer, and a person from HR that asked specifically, which platform do you prefer to work on? Because what the leading theory is for many is that they actually prefer working on the PlayStation 4, right, or the Xbox One, or the Xbox One, or whatever. But these guys were just being bluntly honest, and they said, no, we prefer the PC, because you don't have to use any specific languages, you don't have to use a specific debugger, whereas you do for the console. Then you have to validate the game with the constructor, and then, of course, you've got the other issue, where either Microsoft or Sony has to then approve it. By the way, guys, I am still slightly ill, so if I keep sounding a little bit off, or maybe fumble over words slightly, that's why. I've still got a bit of a migraine and pretty much getting over my cold/flu symptoms, which is not ideal. But anyway, so what about PR? Like, do the programmers and developers, basically they were asked, do you get any say at all what the PR people are actually telling us? And they actually said that they do not get any say in this, despite the fact that the engineers, and I quote, are clearly no peasants, but they were asked questions which they could not answer, or were not able to answer, only implied that there were hardware limitations all over the place, and his wink when they told him about the whole 24 FPS thing was all that needed to confirm that. Now, it's actually quite funny, because I was given a link by a guy on Facebook. I'm not going to mention his name for privacy reasons, although it's a publicly stated, it's actually public on the RGT Facebook wall, but I don't want to give his name out just for privacy. He knows who he is, and he actually provided me a link which goes into the artificial intelligence and cloth simulation and some other stuff, which Ubisoft were discussing. It's actually really interesting. I'm going to be doing an analysis on that over the next couple of days. I'm supposed to be doing it, I was supposed to be tackling it over the last few, but as some of you know, I've just been completely and utterly battered, so it slowed me down a bit, so I'm still finishing off the Evil Within thing, which should be done this weekend. Also do the Alien, and then I can actually focus on this. I just need to crack on, really. But it's actually extremely interesting, and actually goes into some of what they're actually saying here. In other words, it's backing it up, pretty much is what I'm trying to say. Now, my point being, I know a lot of people get very, maybe roll the eyes when it comes to the whole frame rate and resolution situation, but the reason I think this is still very important and still upsetting so many gamers is simple. Because of the dishonesty behind it. For years and years and years, the game industry kept pushing us with better graphics, for faster frame rates, for 1080p. Like, the previous generation consoles, the PS3 and the 360, both pushed 720p like it's standard. And then it was really even starting to push 1080p, in some cases. PS4 and Xbox One as well. When they were marketed initially, you know, it was all 1080p, 1080p, 1080p. Now, we're actually getting to the reality of the matter. And gamers, of course, are like, well, what's going on? And so the reason these videos get so many views, and the reason people are so pissed at this stuff, is because then you get guys and girls and like big studios and smaller studios that then say stuff like Ubisoft did the other day about the whole frame rate situation, saying 30 FPS is more cinematic. Now, the reason I've really got something against this isn't because AC is running at 30 frames per second. It's because then they go ahead and make up excuses like it's more cinematic, which is just factually incorrect, because they're completely and utterly different. As you're not actually interacting with a movie. You have things such as, well, latency, control of the latency, and so on and so forth in a game that you just don't have with a movie. It's like me saying, well, I'm just going to make the silent movie and make everything subtitles because I want to make this movie more like a book. It just doesn't really work. And in fact, it's even worse, because when Ubisoft got called out over the whole frame rate debacle, they then stated, well, actually, we know 60 frames per second is the golden standard with 1080p, and then it kind of became wishy-washy again. So I think that's where people really are starting to get annoyed. Because you've got these situations where they said, well, we're doing parity because we just don't want to cause debates and stuff. Do you really think just because you don't want to cause debates and stuff, people aren't going to ask what the resolution is, and then when they find out, that people aren't going to be pissed? Because here's the situation that you've got. If you're a PS4 owner, you're going to be wondering, well, am I getting an inferior version of the game because the Xbox One's GPU can't keep up? Or maybe because the Xbox One's CPU is slightly faster, maybe the PS4 couldn't do some stuff that the Xbox One could do. Maybe. And then, of course, us PC gamers are saying, well, gee, are we just going to be getting like a cursory, like, here you go, pat, 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 look, you can run at higher resolution, have fun with that, and that's it? Or do we actually get graphics options that are really going to matter? The point being, as I said, I will link to this in the description, but stuff like this obviously happens. We all know this. If you speak to someone who does game testing, you'll be surprised of what bugs actually can be permitted to get through during testing. I actually spoke to someone who was a games tester with the whole Kinect situation with the original Xbox 360 Kinect, and at times, from what I'm hearing, their fault tolerance, I'm not going to give you percentages, but it was really bad. Like, pretty much to the point where it was hit and miss whether something was going to work, and they would have to test it a couple of times, and if it worked just one of those times in some situations, it was actually being let through, from what I'm told. That's not good, is pretty much what I'm saying. And so, personally, here's my point. I think that it's just a really crappy situation for us to be in as consumers, because when we're giving this information, it's now to the point where we don't know if it's truly that it's really the artistic direction. Is it because the systems can't handle it, or is it because one system can handle it but the others can't, so parity? And this is even the same with the Evil Within. You know, the developers are saying, well, we went with the aspect ratio we did so that it looks more cinematic, and that's why we went with 30 frames per second. There are already hacks available for the PC version which gets rid of the bloody borders, which doesn't also utilise the console commands, and I need to do some testing on this. Additionally, might I add, you've got a situation where, and I've been testing this a lot, I've played the PS4, the Xbox One, and the PC version, and I've had a couple of people try it as well. As soon as you turn it to 60 frames a second, you can feel the difference. And, you know, they're saying, well, the reason we use this aspect ratio is because of, you know, making it look good. But I've got to tell you, I'm looking at the frame rate of the consoles. I've actually been doing testing on the console frame rate as well, and it's still dropping frames. And that's with the GPU rendering effectively 30% less of the screen area. Because remember, It's running at like 1920 by like 768, I think, if memory serves. That's natively for the PlayStation 4. It's actually even less for the Xbox One. So my point being, imagine if the GPU was having to do that. It's still dropping frames, but then had to actually render at full 1080p. So you can imagine what that would do to the frame rate. You're basically asking the GPU to do like an extra 30% work. So we're now in this situation as gamers where we don't know why, and there's a lot of, well, I would say there's a lot of miscommunication. And now as gamers we don't really know whether we can trust the studios, and that's not a good situation. However, to play devil's advocate for just a moment, from the perspective of the studio it's also really difficult. Because if they say, well, the Xbox One version is going to be running at, I don't know, 900p, there's so many people that get angry over it and start threatening the developers or start ranting at the developers, you know, you did a crap job or whatever. I can almost understand it. And so I do feel that I don't necessarily blame the companies 100%. I blame the situation where I think consumers have this thing where the industry has hyped them up so much that they expect something, and we as consumers can't really expect it with this level of hardware. It's just a really weird position to be in, and this is one of the reasons I don't necessarily agree that this generation of consoles is going to be around for another 6 or 7 years, because quite frankly with 4K and other technologies really starting to become the forefront, it will just be interesting to see how long really we can push this. Anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I'll see you soon. Hopefully I haven't been too rambly. As I said, I'm still not 100% back to normal, but I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.